Thank you, and last can Corleone, and move the motions. The two motions before the House seek the approval of Dáil Éireann to continue in force provisions of the Offences Against the State Amendment Act of 1998 and the Criminal Justice Amendment Act 2009 aimed at combating terrorism and organised crime. Given the nature of these important provisions, the Houses of the Oireachtas has decided that they should be periodically reviewed. As Minister for Justice, I am required to lay reports before the Oireachtas on the use of the relevant provisions of the two acts and reports covering the 12 months up to the 31st of May 2024, and these were placed in the Oireachtas Library on the 18th of June. Deputies will be aware that the Offences Against the State Amendment Act of 98 was enacted in the aftermath of the Omagh bombing in August of 98. This was a necessary and proportionate response to an atrocious and barbaric act and the murder of 29 innocent people by the real IRA. Our thoughts are always with the families of those who were murdered and indeed the survivors of that heinous act. Last year, the Taoiseach and I met with some of the families of those killed to assure them of the State's commitment to uncovering the truth of what happened. In February, the UK Government established an inquiry into the preventability of the bombing by their state authorities. This Government is anxious to ensure that, as far as possible, that by the end of the UK inquiry there are no unanswered questions relating to the bombing that can only be examined in this state. Officials here have already met with the inquiry team and look forward to continuing this engagement. Since that atrocity, there has been significant progress towards a lasting peace, and I welcome the restoration of the Stormont Assembly and the Power Sharing Executive earlier this year. The recent lowering of the threat level in Northern Ireland from severe to substantial by the UK authorities also represents a welcome development. Nonetheless, the level of threat remains substantial. This means an attack is likely. Regrettable, there remains a real and persistent threat from paramilitary groups. These groups remain committed to violence and are contemptuous of the vast majority of the people on this island who want a future based on peace and founded in the primacy of democratic politics and respect for the rule of law. These provisions of the criminal law provide strong legislative powers to ensure that the Gardaí and the courts are in a position to meet the challenge laid down by those opponents of peace. Section 18 of the 98 Act provides that sections 2 to 4, 6 to 12, 14 and 17 must be renewed by the Oireachtas at least annually if they are to remain in force. The report laid before the Houses includes information provided by the Garda Commissioner on the use of the provisions in question over the past 12 months and a table setting out reported usage figures for each of the years since the Act came into operation. It is notable that 7 of the 12 provisions to be renewed, so sections 3, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 and 17 have not been utilised during the reporting period. Of course, the fact that a provision is not in use in a particular year does not mean that it is redundant or unnecessary, as the usage of different sections can vary from year to year, and we've seen that. The report also provides a brief assessment of the security situation. I should caution, however, that there are clear constraints on the detail of what is and can be reported to ensure that there is no danger of prejudice to the investigation or prosecution of crime or the security of the state. It is clear that the so-called dissident Republicans who have their origins either in the Provisional IRA or the INLA continue to represent a threat. Despite the progress towards peace made over the years, they continue to seek to return to the fruitless violence of the past, and so we must continue to do all that we can to deal with this threat, and let no one be under any illusion that these groups do represent a threat, albeit thankfully this is lower than in the past. They have remained resolute in their opposition to democracy and the rule of law and all that the Good Friday Agreement stands for, and they remain wedded to brutality and criminality. It's also well established that these groups have links to and operate hand in hand with organised criminals. The attempted murder of Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell in February of last year is further proof as to the ruthless and reckless nature of dissident Republicans, and that they are continuing in their attempts to maim and to murder PSNI officers. Thankfully, this very serious and heinous attempted murder was thwarted by the dedicated medical teams and Inspector Caldwell's determined fight for life, thankfully, and it's truly wonderful to see his remarkable recovery. North-South cooperation in this area is absolutely critical, and colleagues in Northern Ireland have acknowledged that cooperation from the Gardaí is strong, indeed automatic when needed most. In recent years, the benefits of that cooperation have been apparent from successful joint operations between An Garda Síochána and the PSNI. In fact, only in the past few weeks, An Garda Síochána uncovered a suspected improvised explosive device at Ravensdale in County Louth as part of a joint operation with the PSNI. There was a long shared history between the two jurisdictions in countering terrorism on this island, and it is essential that we continue to build on this strong cooperation, particularly in the post-Brexit period. As Minister for Justice, I want to pay particular tribute to the Gardaí and to the PSNI officers who continue to cooperate closely and work tirelessly together to keep their communities safe and to counter all threats from terrorism. It's our duty here to ensure that those who are tasked with protecting us from this threat have at their disposal the full and appropriate measures to meet it. In that regard, I'm firmly of the view that the provisions I'm seeking today are necessary and are required to support An Garda Síochána in investigating, disrupting and dismantling the activities of terrorists. The report laid before this House, in addition to providing information on the use of the provisions in question over the past year, also notes the clear view of the Garda Commissioner that this Act continues to be an important tool in ongoing efforts to combat terrorism. Of course, while the 98 Act was a response to what was a domestic threat arising from dissident Republican terrorism, as an open democracy, it's very important that we don't lose sight of the fact that violent extremism and international terrorism is still a threat. There has generally been a deterioration in the international security landscape in recent times, in part due to terrible wars in Ukraine and in the Middle East. Europol, in its most recent report, which was the Terrorism Situation and Trend Report of 2023, sets out the current threat situation at EU level and confirms that terrorism remains a key threat to the EU's internal security, with lone actors remaining the primary perpetrators of terrorist and violent extremist attacks. Radicalisation leading to violent extremism and terrorism is also on the increase in terms of concerns across EU member states, including here in Ireland. Many provisions of the Offences Against the State Act are also capable of being utilised in response to such threats, and we continue to work closely with our EU and international partners in remaining vigilant to the threat posed by violent extremism and international terrorism. Section 8 of the Criminal Justice Amendment Act of 2009 is also the subject of the motion before this House. It refers to a small number of serious organised crime offences that are set out in Part 7 of the Criminal Justice Act 2006. Section 8 of the 2009 Act makes these offences scheduled offences for the purpose of Part 5 of the Offences Against the State Act 1939. That is to say, trials for these offences are to be heard in the Special Criminal Court, subject to the power of the DPP to direct that the offences be tried in the ordinary courts. The purpose of this provision is to guard against the possibility of interference with jury trials by ruthless criminal gangs who seek to behave as though they are beyond the law. It was enacted as a response to a number of difficulties where the justice system was considered to be under serious threat from organised crime. Organised crime groups had shown a particular ruthlessness in their activities, including attacks on witnesses and intimidation of jurors. It was an imperative that the criminal justice system was robust enough to withstand the assault launched upon it through intimidation and violence. I believe most deputies will agree that that imperative remains. Everyone in this House is aware of the threat that society and the criminal justice system face from groups who will stop at nothing to pursue their criminal activities. There's no disputing the damage they have inflicted upon communities through the country. Their willingness to resort to extreme violence, their flagrant disregard for communities and even family gatherings has been apparent in recent months in the shocking killings witnessed in Blanchardstown and Drimnagh, which have been linked to feuds between rival criminal groups. Supporting the efforts of An Garda Síochána to combat organised crime and to bring justice to those involved remains a priority for this government. This is reflected in the record allocation of over €2.35 billion in Budget 2024, which includes investment in boosting surveillance capability with the purchase of a new enhanced air support. An Garda Síochána are working intensively to bear down on criminals involved and they deserve praise for the considerable successes in disrupting their activities and making significant seizures of drugs, cash, weapons, bringing criminals to justice and, most importantly, in preventing further loss of life. I would draw attention to the Joint Task Force operation resulting in the largest drug seizure in the history of the state in the MV Matthew off the coast of Cork last year. Deputies will be very aware of other significant cases in which individuals have been sent forward for trial in the Special Criminal Court again in only recent weeks. As Minister for Justice, I want to again acknowledge the work and this important work that the brave Gardaí who persevere with this day in, day out. The report that I have laid before the House in accordance with Section 8 covers the period from the 1st of June 23 to the 31st of May 24. It includes information provided by the Garda Commissioner on the use over the past 12 months of the provisions in question and details of the relevant offences. What's clear from the report is that An Garda Síochána made significant number of arrests in respect of the offences relevant to Section 8 of the Criminal Justice Amendment Act 2009, with 10 charges laid before the Special Criminal Court and 3 convictions recorded. A further 3 sentencing hearings were dealt with in the Special Criminal Court during the reported period. The view of An Garda Síochána are clearly set out in the report, and it is that the continued operation of this provision is required. It is my strong view, therefore, that Section 8 should be continued in operation for a further 12 months. The House will be aware that last year I published the majority and the minority reports of the Independent Review Group appointed to examine all aspects of the Offences Against the State Acts following their consideration by Government. Following the publication of the reports, my officials have engaged in detailed consultation on the recommendations of the review group and have examined the reports from a variety of perspectives, including policy, governance and legislation. The outputs from this consultation and analysis are informing the preparation of a substantive response to the review, which I will bring to Government for approval in due course. I am firmly of the view that the Offences Against the State Acts have served our country well in combating both subversives and organised crime and have fulfilled a vital role in our criminal justice system. The Special Criminal Court was established to respond to the threat of the state and its people from Republican terrorism over the decades, and it continues to deal with the threat posed by terrorism and, again, the most serious organised crime cases. It serves to eliminate the very real risk to jurors and potential jurors by subversives and ruthless crime groups who place no value on human life. And while it is, of course, my firm view that trial by jury should be preserved to the greatest extent possible, I will not ignore the threat posed by such groups. The Special Criminal Court is only used in very limited circumstances. I'm informed that 15 people were sent forward for trial to the Special Criminal Court last year on 35 charges. The assessment of the majority of the review group was that there is and will continue to be an ongoing need for a non-jury court, as permitted by the Constitution, to try serious criminal offences in certain limited and exceptional circumstances. The report of the review group requires consideration in the context of continuing to safeguard the security of the state and indeed our citizens. Given the importance of the Offences Against the State Act legislation over many decades, and any proposals for reform must be thoroughly considered and approached with the utmost care before determining how best to proceed. This is in order to ensure that we do not do anything to undermine the efforts of the authorities with responsibility for countering terrorism and organised crime and protecting communities. Further consideration is therefore needed to finalise my considered response and to bring proposals to Government for approval. In the meantime, however, and having regard to the very clear view of Garda authorities, as noted in the report that was laid before the House, that the 98 Act continues to be one of the most important tools in ongoing efforts in the fight against terrorism, the need for the renewal of the existing provisions remains to ensure that they continue in operation beyond the 30th of June. There is one further matter which I wish to address. Deputies will be aware that the majority and minority report of the Independent Review Group were broadly aligned in their view that further consideration will be given to the issue of jury reform and the need to improve transparency around the operation of the Special Criminal Court. During last year's renewal debates, I indicated that my officials would be engaging further in relation to these matters, including through consultation with relevant state agencies where required. On the issue of jury reform, I intend to engage with stakeholders to review progress since the LRC report with a view to considering if further action can be taken. Publication of judgments of the Special Criminal Court was also recommended to improve transparency of cases and makes sense. Following engagement with my department, I welcome that the Court Service has now put in place procedures to publish judgments of the Special Criminal Court on its website in a like manner to judgments of the other superior courts, and I expect that this will take place soon. The review group also recommended greater transparency as to how cases get to the Special Criminal Court, how the Director of Prosecution arrives at a decision to direct a case for trial. I understand that the Office of the DPP has committed to making such narrative information available to the public both on its website and in future publications, which again is also a welcome development. The consultation process on the LRC report will also consider the issue of jury tampering and should aid further consideration of this issue. I'm absolutely committed to improving transparency and the availability of data right across the justice sector. The renewal of these acts, Las Cén Corley, is essential as they provide safeguards against those who would seek to undermine the democratic institutions of the state. They are a key part of the state's armoury in tackling terrorism and organised crime, and they are considered absolutely essential by An Garda Síochána. There remains a real and persistent threat from terrorist activity, from so-called dissident Republican paramilitary groups and from international terrorism, which remains a stark reminder of the vulnerability of all open democracies. On the basis of the information set out in those reports and on the advice of the Garda authorities, I propose that the House should approve the continued operation of the relevant provisions of the 98 Act and the 2009 Act for a further 12 months commencing on the 30th of June this year. Thank you.